The morning sun cast a pale golden light over the quiet suburban road. Its warmth doing little to ease the tension etched on Jamal Johnson's face. He gripped the steering wheel of his aging sedan. The faint rattle of the car barely noticeable after years of familiarity. Dressed in his well-worn grocery store uniform, his name stitched in faded blue above his heart, Jamal was focused on the day ahead. Being late wasn't an option. Not when his paycheck held the family together. Up ahead, something unusual broke the monotony of the empty road. A sleek black sedan sat at an awkward angle in a ditch. Its front buried in the earth. Jamal eased his foot off the gas, his brow furrowing. At first, it looked like an abandoned vehicle, another relic of misfortune left to rust. But then he saw a faint movement near the car, a hand weakly reaching toward the road. "Yo," Jamal called out, pulling his car to the shoulder. He stepped out cautiously, gravel crunching beneath his sneakers. "You okay?" The man on the ground, dressed in a suit now stained with dirt and blood, didn't respond immediately. His lips moved, but the words came in broken gasps. Jamal crouched beside him, the faint smell of gasoline and earth filling his lungs. "Help, hospital," the man managed, his voice faint but urgent. Jamal's chest tightened, his father's voice echoed in his mind. A memory as vivid as the day he'd heard it. "You always stop to help, son, even when it costs you something." "All right, I got you," Jamal said, his voice steadier than he felt. He scanned the wrecked car, noting the shattered windshield and the way the front axle bent unnaturally. The man wasn't going anywhere without help. The effort of getting him to Jamal's car was harder than expected. The man was heavier than he looked, and every groan of pain as Jamal moved him made his stomach churn. Beads of sweat rolled down Jamal's face as he maneuvered the man into the passenger seat, careful to keep his injured leg as steady as possible. "Almost there," Jamal muttered, more to himself than to the man. Finally, he slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The familiar groan of the old car made his heart skip a beat. But it roared to life. The ride to the hospital was tense. Jamal kept one eye on the road and the other on the man, whose shallow breaths were the only reassurance that he was still hanging on. "You're gonna be okay," Jamal said, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Just hold on." As the hospital came into view, relief washed over Jamal. He pulled up to the emergency entrance and threw the car into park, leaping out to wave down the staff. "Help. He needs help." Jamal's voice was urgent, cutting through the morning quiet. A team of nurses rushed out with a stretcher, their movements efficient and calm. Jamal stepped back as they lifted the man from the car, their hands practiced and careful. "What happened?" one of the nurses asked, her tone brisk but not unkind. "I found him like this," Jamal explained, his voice tight. "Car in a ditch. He was on the ground when I got there." "You did good bringing him here," she said, her attention quickly shifting back to the man. "We'll take it from here." The automatic doors slid shut behind them, leaving Jamal standing alone under the harsh sunlight. The weight of what he'd just done settled over him, a strange mix of relief and unease. He had done what he could, but the nagging thought of what might happen next lingered. Glancing at the time, Jamal's stomach sank. 25 minutes late. He climbed back into his car, gripping the wheel as he replayed the morning's events in his mind. "Did I do the right thing?" The answer came as a whisper of memory. His father's voice again. "You help because it's right, not because it's easy." But even those words didn't quiet the knot in his stomach as he drove toward work, bracing for what awaited him. The groan of Jamal's car echoed through the grocery store parking lot as he pulled into a spot. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard and winced. 25 minutes late. For a moment, he sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady his nerves. He could already hear Mr. Hansen's voice in his head, cold and impatient. Pushing open the car door, Jamal stepped out and jogged toward the employee entrance. The parking lot buzzed with the sounds of shopping carts and customer chatter. But today it felt heavier, more oppressive. He rehearsed what he would say, hoping that explaining the morning's events might soften the blow. Inside, the fluorescent lights were as bright and unyielding as always. Near the clock in terminal stood Mr. Hansen, his arms crossed over his chest, His crisp white shirt was buttoned to the top, his icy blue eyes locking onto Jamal like a hawk spotting prey. "You're late," Hansen said sharply, his voice cutting through the hum of the store. "I know, sir," Jamal began, still catching his breath, "but there was an accident." "I don't want to hear it." Hansen's tone was dismissive, his expression hard. "You're always trying to pull something, aren't you? Maybe you think being young means you can show up when you feel like it." Jamal bit back the rising frustration in his chest. "It's not like that, sir. I stopped to help a man. His car was in a ditch. And he was hurt bad. I had to get him to the hospital." Hansen's brow furrowed, his lips curling into a humorless sneer. "A man in a ditch? That's the best you've got?" He chuckled coldly. "Creative, I'll give you that. But excuses don't keep the store running." Jamal took a deep breath, his voice steady but firm. "It's not an excuse. I saved a man's life. He could have died out there." The word boy landed like a slap, sharp and cutting. Jamal's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You're fired," Hansen said, his voice final. "Pack up your locker and get out." For a moment, Jamal stood frozen, disbelief coursing through him. "You're really firing me? After what I just told you?" Hansen didn't flinch. "I don't care if you rescued the president himself. Late is late. Now get out." The words stung more than Jamal expected. But he refused to let Hansen see it. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the back room. His sneakers scuffed against the polished floor, each step heavier than the last. At his locker, he packed up his things in silence, the sting of humiliation mixing with the weight of uncertainty. He thought of his mother, her frail frame and tired eyes, and his younger siblings, full of energy and oblivious to the struggles around them. They depended on him. By the time Jamal climbed back into his car, the adrenaline of the morning had worn off, leaving behind an ache he couldn't quite place. His hands gripped the steering wheel as his mind replayed the confrontation. "I did the right thing, didn't I?" But the word boy lingered, a reminder of how quickly others could diminish his worth. It wasn't just about being late. He knew that. Hansen had made that clear. The car rattled down the road as Jamal drove aimlessly, unsure of where to go. He spotted a small diner with a faded sign reading Maggie's Place and pulled into the gravel lot. The smell of coffee and bacon greeted him as he stepped inside. The diner was quiet, with a few scattered customers. Jamal slid into a booth, pulling his name tag from his pocket and shoving it deep into his jacket. A waitress approached, her smile warm but faintly tired. "What can I get you, sweetheart?" "Just coffee," Jamal muttered, keeping his gaze on the table. She nodded and returned moments later with a steaming mug. "Rough morning?" she asked gently. Jamal hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, something like that." She gave him a sympathetic look before walking away, leaving him to his thoughts. Jamal stared into the swirling steam of the coffee, his father's words echoing again. "You help people when they need it, even if it costs you something." Jamal sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I did the right thing, Dad," he muttered under his breath. "But it still sucks." He left a few crumpled bills on the counter and headed back to his car. The drive home felt longer than usual, the weight of the morning pressing down on him. When he finally pulled into the driveway, he sat there for a moment, staring at the peeling paint and sagging roof of the house. "How am I going to tell Mom?" With a deep breath, Jamal stepped out and walked inside, bracing for what would come next. The creak of the front door echoed through the quiet house as Jamal stepped inside. The familiar scent of old wood and faint mildew greeted him, a constant reminder of the house's age and the many repairs it needed. He hesitated in the entryway, his eyes scanning the peeling paint on the walls, the cracked linoleum floor, and the damp stain on the ceiling that seemed to grow larger with every rainstorm. From the small kitchen, his mother's voice called out, raspy and low, "Jamal, that you?" He stepped into the kitchen and found her seated at the table. A chipped mug of tea rested in her hands, and her frail figure was hunched over slightly, a cardigan draped over her thin shoulders. She looked up at him, concern etched into her tired features. "You're home early." Jamal swallowed hard, gripping the back of a chair. "Yeah," he said quietly, "had a change of plans." Before his mother could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps filled the air. His younger brother, Terrell, burst into the room, his energy boundless as always. Jamal, you're home early. Does that mean you can play with us now? Kira, his younger sister, followed closely behind, clutching her worn teddy bear. Not right now, Jamal said, forcing a smile and ruffling Terrell's hair. Go on, I need to talk to Mom for a minute. The children hesitated, sensing the weight in his tone, but eventually retreated, their laughter fading into the background. Jamal turned back to his mother, who was watching him intently. What happened? She asked, her voice soft but steady. Jamal exhaled, lowering himself into a chair across from her. There was an accident, he began. I was on my way to work, and I saw this car in a ditch. The driver was hurt bad, he could barely move. I couldn't just leave him there, so I drove him to the hospital. His mother's brow furrowed with concern. Is he okay? I don't know, Jamal admitted. I didn't stay long enough to find out. I did what I could and left. But, his voice faltered, and he stared at the table. I got fired, Mom. I was late, and Mr. Hanson didn't care why. His mother's sharp intake of breath filled the small kitchen. Fired? She whispered. After what you just told me. Jamal nodded, the weight of the morning pressing down on him again. He didn't even let me explain. Just said I was late. And that was that. Her face fell, and she leaned back in her chair, clutching her chest as if steadying herself. Jamal, how are we going to manage now? The bills, the groceries, my medicine. I'll figure something out, Jamal said quickly, though his stomach churned at his own uncertainty. Don't stress about it, Mom. I'll find another job. Don't stress, she repeated, shaking her head. You're the only one holding this family together. You know I can't work anymore. The doctor bills keep piling up. And now, Mom, Jamal interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. I'll take care of it. You don't have to worry. Her eyes filled with tears. But she nodded, her voice trembling. You're too young to carry all this on your shoulders. Jamal. He reached across the table, resting a hand on hers. I've got this, he said, his tone steady despite the storm raging inside him. You just focus on getting better. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling between them. In the other room, Terrell and Kira's laughter broke the stillness, their innocent joy a stark contrast to the heavy reality in the kitchen. His mother glanced toward the sound, a faint smile tugging at her lips. They don't understand, do they? How hard it is. No, Jamal said quietly, and they don't need to. Let them be kids while they still can. The whistle of the kettle broke the moment, and Jamal rose to turn off the stove, pouring the boiling water into his mother's mug. She wrapped her hands around it, her gaze distant but filled with gratitude. Thanks, baby, she said softly. I'll figure it out, Jamal repeated, more to himself than to her. I promise. Miles away, in the sterile hum of a hospital room, Anthony Crawford stirred, his eyes fluttered open, and the blinding white of the ceiling came into focus. Beside him, his wife Evelyn sat, her hand clasping his tightly. Anthony, she said softly, relief flooding her voice as she leaned forward. You're awake. He blinked, his mind foggy, and tried to sit up, only to wince as pain shot through his ribs. What happened? Don't move, Evelyn urged, adjusting his pillows. You were in an accident. Your car went off the road. Fragments of the crash flickered through Anthony's mind, the swerve, the impact, the ditch. How did I get here? Evelyn hesitated. A young man found you. He brought you to the hospital. A young man, Anthony murmured, his brow furrowing as he tried to recall. The memory was hazy, but a faint image surfaced, dark eyes, steady hands, a voice that reassured him in his weakest moment. I don't remember much, but he was wearing a uniform. A grocery store uniform. We'll find him, Evelyn said, her tone resolute. He saved your life, Anthony. We owe him that much. Anthony nodded faintly, his gratitude stirring despite the pain that clouded his thoughts. Somewhere out there was a boy who had done what others might not. And now, Anthony felt a growing need to make sure that kindness didn't go unrecognized. The morning sun cast long shadows on the cracked pavement as Jamal stepped out of his house. The familiar creak of the screen door and the muffled laughter of his siblings echoed behind him. His mother had insisted he take a moment to clear his head after the news of his firing. And he reluctantly agreed, though he wasn't sure what a walk would solve. He wandered down the narrow streets of his neighborhood. The uneven sidewalks bordered by sagging fences and overgrown lawns. The community had seen better days. But it was home, a place where Jamal had always known he belonged. Despite its flaws. As he walked, his mind raced. Losing his job had shaken him. But it wasn't the first time life had thrown him into a tailspin. He had always found a way to land on his feet. Yet, this time felt different. His family depended on him in ways that most people his age couldn't imagine. The weight of their struggles bore down on him with every step. Each crack in the pavement a silent reminder of all that needed fixing. Further up the road, the hum of a car engine pulled Jamal's attention. A sleek black SUV, its polished exterior gleaming in the sunlight, turned onto his street. It was out of place here. An anomaly in a neighborhood where cars were often older than their drivers. Jamal slowed his pace, his brow furrowing as the vehicle crept closer, eventually pulling to a stop in front of his house. The door of the SUV opened, and a man stepped out, leaning heavily on a cane. His tailored suit and steady posture spoke of a life far removed from Jamal's reality. A woman followed, her elegance understated but striking, her expression both warm and determined. Jamal's pulse quickened as he recognized the man. It was the stranger he had helped from the ditch. The man, Anthony Crawford, nodded toward Jamal as if confirming something to himself. "You must be Jamal," he said, his voice steady but quiet, carrying the weight of gratitude. Jamal hesitated, his body tensing. He wasn't used to attention, especially from strangers who arrived in SUVs with tinted windows. "Yeah," he said cautiously, "that's me." Anthony stepped closer, his movements slow but deliberate. "I've been looking for you," he said, "for days now. My wife and we wanted to thank you." Jamal shifted his weight, glancing at the SUV and then back at Anthony. "You didn't have to bring the police," he said, nodding toward the cruiser parked behind their car. Evelyn Crawford stepped forward, her voice calm and reassuring. "We didn't mean to alarm you. We just wanted to make sure we could find you. And they helped us do that." Jamal's unease lingered, but the sincerity in her tone gave him pause. "Okay," he said finally, his voice low. "What do you want to thank me for?" "For saving my life," Anthony said simply. His words carried no embellishment, no pretense, just the unvarnished truth. Jamal blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the statement. He had spent the past few days wrestling with the aftermath of his actions. But he hadn't thought about how they might have affected the man he'd saved. "I just did what anyone would do," he said. Anthony shook his head, his expression firm. "No, you didn't. A lot of people would have kept driving, pretending they didn't see anything. But you stopped. You got me to the hospital. You gave me a chance to be here today." Evelyn smiled, her warmth cutting through the tension in the air. "We wanted to meet you, Jamal, to hear your story, if you'll let us." Jamal glanced back at the house, the peeling paint and sagging roof suddenly feeling like an indictment of his life. He didn't want to bring them inside, but he also didn't want to turn them away. "Yeah," he said after a pause. "Come in." The Crawfords followed Jamal into the small, cluttered living room. The mismatched furniture, faded curtains, and scuffed floors told the story of a family doing their best with what little they had. Jamal's mother rose from her chair, her face pale but her posture steady despite the surprise of their unexpected visitors. "This is my mom," Jamal said, his voice steady but laced with a hint of protectiveness. "And these are my siblings, Terrell and Kira." Evelyn crouched slightly, meeting the children's curious gazes with a warm smile. "Hello, Terrell." "Hello, Kira. It's nice to meet you." The children shuffled closer to their mother, their wide eyes fixed on the strangers. Jamal's mother offered a polite nod, her voice soft. "You're the man Jamal helped?" Anthony stepped forward, leaning on his cane. "I am. Your son saved my life. Ma'am, I'm here because of him." Her hand gripped the edge of the table as she sank back into her chair. He told me what happened. But, hearing it from you, thank God you're okay. Anthony glanced around the room, taking in the worn furniture and faded walls. His gaze lingered on the crack running along the ceiling, and his jaw tightened. We wanted to thank Jamal for what he did, he said, his voice low, but we also want to help. Jamal's eyes narrowed, suspicion creeping into his voice. Help? How? Evelyn leaned forward, her tone gentle but resolute. Your mom shouldn't have to choose between her health and keeping this family afloat. We want to cover her medical expenses. Jamal blinked, his voice faltering. What? You don't have to. We do. Anthony interrupted, his tone firm, because it's the right thing to do. Evelyn nodded. And this house, it's not safe. It's not what your family deserves. We'd like to help you find something better. Somewhere you can all feel secure. Jamal's fists clenched at his sides, the enormity of their offer crashing over him like a wave. Why? He asked finally, his voice trembling. Why would you do this for us? Anthony met his gaze, his expression unwavering. Because you stopped for me when you didn't have to. You showed me kindness, and I want to repay that kindness. The room fell silent, the weight of Anthony's words settling over everyone. Jamal's mother reached out, her hand trembling as she clasped Evelyn's. Thank you, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Thank you so much. Evelyn squeezed her hand, her own eyes glistening. You've raised an incredible son. Let us help lighten the load. Jamal looked at his mother, the quiet strength in her gaze urging him to accept what was being offered. Slowly, he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. Okay. Anthony smiled, the warmth in his expression breaking through the tension. Good, he said. Let's get started. As the Crawfords outlined their plans, a glimmer of hope began to take root in the small living room, growing steadily against the backdrop of peeling paint and worn furniture. For the first time in a long time, the weight on Jamal's shoulders felt just a little bit lighter. The moving truck hummed softly in the crisp morning air as Jamal stood on the edge of the neatly trimmed lawn, staring at the house before him. It was a modest but sturdy home, with fresh white paint and green shutters that framed the windows like a picture-perfect postcard. The lawn, lush and even, stretched out under the golden morning light, and the driveway was free of the cracks and oil stains he'd grown used to. Jamal's mother stood beside him, leaning slightly on her cane. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she took in the sight of their new home. It wasn't grand, but it was everything their old house had never been: safe, clean, and full of possibility. It's beautiful, she whispered, her voice trembling. I never thought. Her words trailed off as she turned to Jamal, her hand gripping his arm. He gave her a small smile, his own chest tight with emotion. It's real, Mom. We're here. Behind them, Terrell and Kira darted out of the moving truck, their laughter ringing through the quiet neighborhood. Terrell immediately ran across the yard, his sneakers kicking up small puffs of dew. We can actually play soccer here, he shouted, his voice bursting with excitement. Kira twirled in circles, clutching her teddy bear to her chest. Look, Jamal, she called out. I can spin without bumping into anything. Jamal chuckled softly, shaking his head. Their joy was contagious, even as he felt the weight of everything it had taken to get here. Anthony and Evelyn Crawford stood a few feet away, watching the family with quiet satisfaction. Anthony leaned on his cane, his sharp eyes softened by a rare tenderness. What do you think? He asked Jamal, his voice calm but edged with hope. Jamal glanced at him, then back at the house. It's more than I ever imagined, he admitted, his voice low. Thank you. Evelyn stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on Jamal's mother's shoulder. You deserve this, she said softly. All of you. Inside, the house was coming to life as the movers brought in furniture, each piece settling into place with an air of permanence. The smell of fresh paint and newly cleaned floors replaced the damp, musty scent that had lingered in their old home. The kitchen gleamed with polished countertops and a full set of cabinets, free from the sagging doors and cracked linoleum of their past. Jamal found himself wandering through the house, his footsteps echoing softly in the empty spaces. He stopped in what was now his room, a small but bright space with light blue walls and a wide window overlooking the yard. A sturdy desk sat by the window, its surface clean and smooth, with a new backpack resting on the chair. Inside the backpack, he knew, were notebooks and supplies, a gesture from the Crawfords to prepare him for his return to school. As he ran his hand over the desk, Evelyn appeared in the doorway. "How does it feel?" she asked gently. Jamal turned to her, his voice quiet. "It feels like a dream." She smiled, stepping inside. "You've earned this," she said. "And school, that's your focus now. Anthony and I have taken care of your tuition and supplies. All you need to do is work hard." Jamal hesitated, the weight of their generosity pressing down on him. "I'll make it count," he said firmly. "I promise." Evelyn nodded, her expression warm. "We know you will." The following week, Jamal found himself standing outside the gates of Greenfield High School. His new backpack hung heavy on his shoulders, not just with books, but with the weight of his own expectations. He took a deep breath, stepping onto the campus where he hadn't set foot in over a year. The familiar rhythm of the school day quickly enveloped him, the chatter of students in the hallways, the screech of chairs on tiled floors, the faint smell of old textbooks. His teachers, surprised to see him return, greeted him with a mix of curiosity and encouragement. In class, Jamal worked with a quiet determination, his focus unshakable. He asked questions when he didn't understand, took detailed notes, and stayed late in the library to catch up on missed assignments. One afternoon, a classmate leaned over during a math lesson, her voice a whisper. "You're really going for it, huh?" Jamal glanced at her and nodded. "Yeah," he said simply. "I've got a lot to make up for." She smiled. "You'll catch up in no time." Back at home, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Jamal's mother started her medical treatments, and though the road to recovery was long, the improvements were already visible. She had more energy, more color in her cheeks, and a lightness in her step that Jamal hadn't seen in years. Terrell and Kira thrived in their new surroundings, their laughter filling the house in a way that made it feel truly alive. They often dragged Jamal outside to play in the yard, their joy infectious despite his exhaustion from schoolwork. One evening, as the family gathered around their new dining table, Jamal's mother clasped her hands together. "Let's take a moment," she said, her voice full of emotion, "to thank God for these blessings and to thank the Crawfords for everything they've done." Jamal bowed his head, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He wasn't just thankful, he was determined. This second chance wasn't something he would take for granted. As the weeks passed, Jamal's confidence grew. His teachers began to notice his unwavering dedication, and his classmates often looked to him for help with assignments. The Crawfords remained a constant presence, checking in regularly to ensure the family had everything they needed. During one of their visits, Anthony brought a stack of books to Jamal's desk. "Thought these might help," he said, his tone casual but thoughtful. "Study guides for your classes. If you need help, let me know." Jamal flipped through the books, his chest tightening with gratitude. "Thanks, Mr. Crawford," he said quietly. "I'll use them." Anthony smiled. "I know you will. You're going to do great things, Jamal. I can already see it." Jamal didn't respond immediately, but his resolve deepened. He didn't just want to succeed for himself, he wanted to honor the faith others had placed in him. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling of his new room, Jamal whispered quietly, "I won't let them down." And for the first time in a long time, he truly believed it. Jamal stood outside the bustling office building, its glass facade reflecting the late afternoon sun. This wasn't just another errand. It was the first day of his internship at Crawford Industries, a position Anthony Crawford himself had encouraged him to take. Jamal adjusted his tie nervously, a gift from Evelyn, who had handed it to him that morning with an encouraging smile. "It's a symbol of confidence," she had said, "and you've earned the right to wear it." The lobby was vast, filled with polished floors and sleek furniture, buzzing with the hum of professionals moving purposefully. Jamal's nerves prickled as he approached the reception desk. The woman behind it, a polished professional with sharp glasses, glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Yes," Jamal said, his voice steady but tinged with apprehension. I'm Jamal Howard. I'm starting my internship today. Her gaze flicked over him briefly before she nodded and gestured toward the elevators. Take the elevator to the 10th floor. Someone will meet you there. As Jamal stepped into the elevator, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the mirrored walls. His tailored shirt and freshly shined shoes contrasted sharply with the worn sneakers and faded uniforms of his past. Yet, despite the polished exterior, he felt the familiar tension of being an outsider in an unfamiliar world. On the 10th floor, a young woman greeted him with a warm smile. Hi, Jamal. I'm Lydia, your mentor for the internship. Let me show you around. The tour was brisk but informative. Lydia walked him through the open concept office, pointing out departments and introducing him to colleagues. Jamal noticed the subtle shifts in their expressions when they met him, polite but reserved, as though silently assessing his worth. By the time he reached his desk, a modest corner space with a laptop and a stack of documents, Jamal was already replaying the interactions in his mind. He knew the weight of assumptions, the unspoken doubts that often followed him into rooms where few people looked like him. Lydia must have sensed his unease. You'll do great here, she said, her voice kind but firm. Just focus on the work. Let it speak for itself. Over the next few weeks, Jamal immersed himself in his assignments. He analyzed data, prepared reports, and attended team meetings, always listening intently and taking meticulous notes. Yet, he couldn't ignore the subtle undercurrent in the office. The way some colleagues spoke over him in meetings, or how his suggestions were met with cautious nods rather than enthusiasm. One afternoon, during a lunch break, Jamal sat alone in the cafeteria, reviewing a project outline. A group of colleagues sat a few tables away, their laughter rising above the clatter of trays and silverware. He couldn't help but overhear snippets of their conversation. He's got potential, one said. Sure, another replied, her tone doubtful. But does he really fit here? You know how Anthony can be, always trying to give back. The words stung more than Jamal cared to admit. He knew they weren't uncommon sentiments, especially in spaces where he was seen as a charity case rather than a deserving peer. He tightened his grip on his pen, reminding himself why he was here. This wasn't just about proving himself. It was about building something bigger, for his family and for the countless others who shared his journey. That evening, Jamal stayed late at the office, poring over data for a presentation. The building was quiet, the hum of air conditioning the only sound. He was so engrossed in his work that he didn't notice Anthony Crawford enter the room until his deep voice broke the silence. Burning the midnight oil? Anthony asked, his cane tapping softly against the floor as he approached. Jamal looked up, startled but grateful for the interruption. Just trying to make sure everything's perfect for tomorrow's meeting. Anthony smiled, settling into a chair across from him. Perfection is a moving target. Jamal, focus on progress instead. Jamal nodded, his mind replaying the doubts he had overheard earlier. Mr. Crawford, he began hesitantly. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think I belong here? Anthony's expression softened, and he leaned forward, resting his hands on his cane. Jamal, let me tell you something I've learned over the years. Belonging isn't about fitting into someone else's mold. It's about making your own space and proving that your voice matters. Jamal hesitated. But what if people don't see that? What if they think I'm just here because of you? Anthony's eyes narrowed slightly, his tone firm. People will always find reasons to doubt you. Jamal, that's human nature. But what matters is how you respond. Do the work, show them what you're capable of, and never let their assumptions define you. The words settled over Jamal like a warm blanket, easing the tension that had built up over the day. Thank you, he said quietly. Anthony smiled. Now, go home and get some rest. Tomorrow's a big day. The next morning, Jamal stood before a conference room filled with senior executives. His presentation displayed on the screen behind him. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie. But he steadied himself with a deep breath. As he began to speak, the room fell silent. He explained his analysis clearly and concisely, fielding questions with confidence. By the time he finished, the tension in the room had shifted. The executives nodded in approval. And one of them, a sharp-eyed woman with silver hair, leaned forward. "Well done," she said. "That was thorough and insightful." As the meeting ended, Lydia caught Jamal's eye and gave him a thumbs up. For the first time since he started, Jamal felt something shift. Not in the office, but within himself. He had earned his place. Not through charity, but through hard work and determination. Later that day, as he packed up his desk, Anthony passed by and gave him a knowing nod. Jamal smiled back, his confidence no longer tentative but quietly assured. In the weeks that followed, Jamal continued to grow into his role, his contributions earning the respect of his colleagues. And while the doubts and whispers didn't disappear entirely, they began to fade, replaced by a recognition of his capabilities. For Jamal, this wasn't just a job. It was a bridge. One he was building brick by brick. Not just for himself, but for others who might follow. The days at Crawford Industries settled into a steady rhythm for Jamal. His desk, once a symbol of uncertainty, had become a space where ideas were born and honed. His contributions grew more significant, his insights sharper. Slowly, his colleagues began to approach him, seeking advice or simply chatting during lunch breaks. It wasn't an immediate shift but a gradual easing of the invisible wall that had separated him from the rest. One such moment came when Lydia stopped by his desk after a morning meeting. "You know," she said, her voice casual but warm, "you've got a knack for explaining things clearly. The way you broke down that report. It made the rest of us look at it differently." Jamal looked up, slightly surprised. "Thanks," he said, his tone modest. "I just tried to focus on what mattered most." "Well, it worked," Lydia said, offering him a genuine smile before walking away. The compliment lingered with Jamal. It wasn't just the words but the tone, a shift from polite acknowledgement to sincere respect. Despite the progress, there were still moments that reminded Jamal of the gaps that remained. The unspoken biases that lingered beneath the surface. One afternoon, while he was waiting for an elevator, two colleagues approached, deep in conversation. "Did you see the new hire?" one of them asked. A tall man with an easy confidence. "Top of his class at Harvard. Apparently. Impressive," the other replied. "Not like some of the charity cases we've had lately." Jamal's chest tightened. The words weren't directed at him, but the insinuation was clear. He kept his gaze forward, his posture composed, even as the sting of the comment settled in. The elevator doors opened, and Jamal stepped inside, the two colleagues continuing their conversation as though he wasn't there. As the doors closed, he reminded himself of Anthony's advice: do the work. Let it speak for itself. Later that evening, Jamal sat in his small apartment, the city lights flickering through the window. His laptop was open on the coffee table, a half-finished presentation glowing on the screen. Yet his thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation at the elevator. He reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts, stopping at Anthony's name. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure whether to call, but then he pressed the button. The familiar ring calming him as he waited. "Jamal." Anthony's voice came through, warm and steady. "What's on your mind?" Jamal hesitated. "Do you ever feel like no matter how much you do, some people will always see you a certain way?" There was a pause on the other end, then a soft chuckle. "More times than I can count," Anthony admitted. "But here's the thing, Jamal. Those people? They don't matter. Their opinions are rooted in their own insecurities, their own fears. You don't have to carry that. But it's hard not to," Jamal said, his voice quieter. "Especially when it feels like you're constantly proving yourself. You're not alone in that," Anthony said gently. "Every step forward, every achievement, it's not just for you. It's for the ones who come after. And trust me, Jamal, you're laying a path that others will follow." The words settled over Jamal like a balm, soothing the unease that had been gnawing at him. "Thanks," he said simply. "Anytime," Anthony replied. "Now get some rest. You've got a big day tomorrow. Don't you?" Jamal smiled faintly. "Yeah, I do." The next morning, Jamal walked into the office with a renewed sense of purpose. The whispers, the doubts, they would always exist in some form, but they didn't define him. During the team meeting, Jamal presented his findings on a project that had been stalled for weeks. He spoke with clarity and confidence, his ideas sparking a lively discussion among the team. Even the tall man from the elevator leaned forward, nodding as Jamal outlined his proposal. When the meeting ended, Lydia clapped him on the shoulder. "You nailed it," she said. Jamal nodded, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. That evening, as Jamal walked home, the city felt different. The weight he had been carrying seemed lighter, the air a little clearer. He thought about his mother and siblings, about the sacrifices they had all made to get here. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself a moment of pride. Not the loud, boastful kind, but a quiet acknowledgement of how far he had come. It wasn't just about belonging anymore. It was about creating something lasting, something meaningful, and Jamal knew he was just getting started. The conference room was quiet, save for the soft shuffle of papers and the occasional click of a pen. Jamal stood at the head of the table, his presentation displayed on the large screen behind him. The meeting was a culmination of weeks of preparation, and the eyes of senior executives were fixed on him as he delivered his final points. And with this approach, he concluded, his voice measured and calm, "We're not just solving an immediate problem, we're laying the foundation for sustainable growth." There was a moment of silence as the executives exchanged glances. Then, the chairman, a man whose approval carried significant weight, spoke. "Impressive work," he said, nodding. "This is the kind of strategic thinking we need." Jamal inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the compliment without letting it linger. As the meeting adjourned, his colleagues began to file out, offering him brief words of praise. But it wasn't the applause or the recognition that stayed with Jamal. It was the sense of quiet accomplishment, the knowledge that he had earned his place at the table. That evening, Jamal sat alone on a bench overlooking the city skyline. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the buildings and painting the horizon in hues of orange and gold. He thought about the journey that had brought him here. The small, pivotal moments that had shaped his path. The car in the ditch, his mother's quiet resilience, Anthony's unwavering belief in him. And he thought about the quieter struggles, the ones that went unspoken but left their mark nonetheless. The lingering doubts in the eyes of some colleagues, the coded words that carried deeper meaning, the invisible line he often felt he was walking. These moments, though painful, had not broken him. Instead, they had sharpened his resolve, deepened his understanding of the world and his place within it. A soft vibration from his phone broke his reverie. He glanced at the screen. A message from Anthony. "Proud of you. Keep going." Jamal smiled faintly, his fingers hovering over the keyboard before typing a simple reply. "Thank you. I won't forget." He set the phone down and leaned back, letting the cool evening air wash over him. In the weeks that followed, Jamal continued to push forward, balancing his growing responsibilities at work with his commitments to the community. He had begun mentoring a group of high school students through a program focused on leadership and career development. One Saturday morning, he stood before the group, his voice steady as he shared his story. Not the polished version, but the real one, with all its struggles and setbacks. "Success isn't about avoiding failure," he told them. "It's about what you do when you face it. And it's about remembering who you are, even when the world tries to tell you otherwise." The students listened intently, their eyes reflecting a mix of curiosity and hope. After the session ended, one of them, a quiet girl with sharp eyes, approached him. "Do you ever feel like you don't belong?" she asked hesitantly. Jamal considered her question, his gaze steady. "I used to," he admitted, "but then I realized something. Belonging isn't about waiting for others to accept you. It's about knowing your worth and standing firm in it." The girl nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding crossing her face. That evening, as Jamal returned home, he found his mother waiting on the porch. She was healthier now, her steps steadier and her smile less burdened. "Terrell called," she said as he joined her. "He's acing his classes. Said he wants to be an engineer like his brother." Jamal chuckled softly. "He's always been the smart one." She gave him a knowing look. "Don't sell yourself short, Jamal. You've done more than you realize." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the stars beginning to emerge in the night sky. "Do you ever think about Dad?" he asked quietly. Every day, she replied, her voice soft. And I know he'd be proud of you. Just like I am. Jamal nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. As the months turned into years, Jamal's influence continued to grow. Not just within his company, but in the lives he touched through his mentorship and advocacy. He became known not just for his professional achievements but for his ability to inspire and uplift others. And yet, he remained grounded, his success a quiet testament to the values his parents had instilled in him. One evening, as he prepared for another speaking engagement, Jamal stood before a mirror. Adjusting his tie, he thought about the people who had helped him along the way. The sacrifices they had made, and the belief they had placed in him. This, he realized, was the legacy he wanted to leave. Not just a career marked by success, but a life that made a difference. As he stepped onto the stage, the audience quieted, their attention focused on him. And with that same steady voice, Jamal began to speak, the words flowing not from a script but from the depths of his journey. You don't have to let the world define you, he said. You get to decide who you are. And when you do, you'll find that the horizon is much broader than it seems.